It was shortly after dawn on a cold winter morning in 1944 when the men of the 389th Bomb Group climbed into their B-24 Liberator, a machine they trusted because they had no other choice. They had flown together for months, long enough to speak in shorthand, long enough to finish each other's sentences, long enough to know that on any given day, one engine failure, one burst of flak, or one unseen enemy fighter could erase everything they ever were. But nothing, not a single briefing, not a single story from crews who barely limped home, could prepare them for what was waiting that day in the sky over Europe. Their ship was nicknamed the Iron Angel, a name they'd painted in fading yellow letters along the fuselage, half joking that the plane seemed too stubborn to die and too beat up to fully live. The cold inside the aircraft settled deep into their bones. Frost laced the windows. The engines groaned awake. They rose from the runway with the rest of the formation, a block of silver shapes climbing into gray clouds like a steel cathedral that stretched for miles. The mission was supposed to be routine by the brutal standards of the 8th Air Force. Another industrial site, another target that intelligence insisted would shrink the war by a day or two, another flight straight into the teeth of defenders who had already learned how to read their patterns. The crew knew the drill. Stay tight in formation, trust the lead bombardier, trust the other crews, and hope the flak gunners below were having an off day. They crossed the North Sea in silence, the steady drone of the 4 Pratt & Whitney engines keeping a rhythm as reliable as the beating of a mechanical heart. Frost crept across the navigator's windows, and the waist gunners clenched their hands inside heavy gloves to keep their fingers from stiffening. They were cold, tired, and hungry, but not afraid. Fear had become a luxury they'd forgotten how to feel. What they didn't know, what no one in the entire formation knew, was that just a few miles ahead, inside a bank of cloud that looked no more threatening than any other, another B-24 was climbing slightly off its assigned altitude. A simple error, a tiny drift, a piece of routine turbulence nudging an enormous aircraft a handful of feet higher than it should have been. In a formation of heavy bombers spaced barely a few wingspans apart, a few feet might as well have been a mile or a millimeter depending on where you were standing. The first sign anything was wrong came when the radio crackled with a burst of excited chatter from another ship. Someone yelled about spacing. Someone else barked a correction, and then silence. A silence so sudden it carved a hole in the air. The engineer looked out of the top turret for a moment, trying to spot the source of the problem. He was just starting to turn his head back when he froze. There, emerging from the murk, was the belly of another B-24. Close enough that he could see the rivets along the bomb bay doors. He didn't even have time to shout. The collision sounded like the sky tearing open. Metal sheared against metal with a shriek that stabbed through leather helmets and engine noise, and every layer of adrenaline the crew had built up over the past months. The left wing of the other B-24 sliced across the Iron Angel's cockpit like a gigantic spinning blade. The pilot's windscreen burst inward in a storm of glass. The co-pilot was thrown sideways as the control column jerked violently. The nose section buckled, and for a moment the aircraft rolled so sharply that the horizon disappeared in a blur of cloud and debris. Inside the waist section, the gunners were thrown off their feet. One man slammed into the bulkhead and felt something crack in his ribs. Another dropped his gun and scrambled to grab it before it tumbled out of its mount. The tail gunner saw the sky cartwheel and thought, for one quiet, frozen second, that the aircraft had already broken apart and that he was falling, weightless, toward the ground. But they weren't falling. Not yet. The pilot struggled to regain control, wrestling the Liberator as if it were an angry animal fighting against its own death. One of the engines coughed out black smoke. Another shuddered. A gaping wound in the upper fuselage let in a roaring blast of freezing air that made breathing painful. The engineer shouted that the hydraulic lines were severed. The intercom sparked in and out. The bombardier yelled that the nose gear was half torn off. The navigator was bleeding from a cut above his eye, but insisted he could still read his charts. They were a flying ruin. A crippled metal coffin suspended by luck, stubbornness, and what little lift remained in their battered wings. Worse still, they were still deep in enemy territory, with the target ahead and the long journey home behind them. Most crews in that situation would bail out, and many did. It was standard. It was expected. A bomber with that kind of damage, that early in the mission, had almost no chance of making it back. But the men of the Iron Angel made a choice that defied every statistic, every rule of probability, and every cold calculation ever written in a military manual. They decided to stay. They decided to try to bring the wounded aircraft home. The pilot steadied the trembling ship and radioed the formation that they would not be continuing to the target. He asked for an escort, but the lead replied that fighters were already stretched thin. If they were going to survive, they'd have to do it alone. The crew tightened their oxygen masks and checked each other for injuries. The waist gunners braced themselves against the cold wind, blasting through the torn fuselage. The radio operator tried to raise emergency channels, but the collision had damaged their long-range set. The bombardier climbed back into his seat and clipped himself in, not because he still had bombs to drop, but because he refused to leave his post. For the first time in the entire war, the iron-willed men of the 389th Bomb Group felt real fear. Yet even then, they pushed forward. They turned the battered Liberator toward the west, toward the long, uncertain path back to England. Every minute felt like a negotiation with gravity. Every gust of wind made the aircraft shudder. Every mile carried the risk of an engine seizing, a fuel leak igniting, or the entire fuselage finally giving up and tearing open in midair. But the crew hung on. They talked to each other through the failing intercom. They encouraged each other when the cold made their fingers numb. They kept scanning the sky for enemy fighters, knowing that even a single Messerschmitt could finish them in seconds. As they limped across the front lines, a few Allied fighters spotted them. P-51 Mustangs, sleek and fast. They circled the wounded bomber like guardians, peeling off each time they saw a threat and returning again. Their presence didn't fix the damage, but it gave the crew something they desperately needed: hope. Hours passed. The engines coughed and wheezed. The pilot fought cramps in his legs. The navigator wiped blood from his eyes to read the coastline. And then, through the haze of exhaustion, someone shouted the words that electrified the entire crew. "Landfall ahead! England!" They weren't safe yet, but for the first time since the collision, survival felt possible. England. Just the word carried weight. Thick, warm, almost unbelievable. After hours of fighting a machine that no longer wanted to stay in the sky, the sight of that familiar coastline felt unreal. The pilot blinked hard, as if afraid the land would vanish if he looked at it too directly. The co-pilot, his hands trembling from cold and adrenaline, whispered a prayer he'd repeated on every mission but never with this much emotion behind it. They had reached friendly territory, but the danger was far from over. The aircraft was barely holding itself together. The pilot called for a radio check, and the reply came back wrapped in static. The engineer shouted that the hydraulic pressure was fluctuating again. In the tail, the gunner could feel the structure vibrating with a sickening rhythm, as if the metal was speaking its last words. The pilot keyed the battered transmit switch. "Control, this is Iron Angel, returning from mission with heavy structural damage. Request emergency landing. Repeat, emergency landing." The response came with a calmness the crew couldn't muster. "Iron Angel, roger, divert to the nearest priority field. Runway clear, wind steady out of the west." The men exchanged glances. It was happening, they were going home. But even that final stretch came with a new wave of fear. Landing a crippled bomber was often more dangerous than getting it home. If the landing gear collapsed, if the nose section snapped further, if the weakened wing structure gave way, it would end in a fireball. The bombardier crawled back to the nose, what was left of it, and tried to assess the gear's condition. Cold air roared around him like a living thing. He leaned forward, squinting through the shattered glass. Then he swore softly. The nose gear was twisted at an angle no aircraft designer ever intended. He climbed back and grabbed the intercom. "Nose gear's damaged. Don't rely on it. You're gonna have to set her down soft, or she's coming apart." The pilot acknowledged with a simple reply, "Copy." And then he added, "Do me a favor, strap in tight." The runway appeared ahead like a thin black line carved into the green countryside. Emergency crews were already in place, tiny figures in yellow gear standing by trucks with hoses ready. The base commander watched from the tower, binoculars fixed on the incoming wreck. The air around Iron Angel trembled with the sound of struggling engines. The pilot eased back on the throttles. The ship sank lower. The damaged left wing dipped for a moment, and the pilot fought it, leveling off with a grunt. Inside the aircraft, the crew braced for impact. The tail gunner lowered his head against the armor plate. The waist gunners locked their harnesses tighter. The radio operator closed his eyes. The navigator whispered the names of his family. Every man knew that even if they survived the landing, it might not be gentle. The wheels hit the runway with a jarring slam. The aircraft lurched violently left. The pilot corrected. The nose dipped, threatening to collapse. The engineer shouted that hydraulic pressure was dropping again. The plane wobbled, skidding slightly. For an instant, the left wheel lifted off the ground. And then, with a scream of tortured metal, the bomber straightened and rolled forward, slowing until finally, mercifully, it came to a shuddering halt. Silence. An impossible, overwhelming silence. The men didn't move for a moment. They just sat there, stunned, breathing the cold air and listening to the ticking of cooling metal. It took nearly 30 seconds before the pilot unbuckled his harness and let out a shaky laugh. It wasn't a loud laugh, but it carried through the wreck, warm and disbelieving. Then the co-pilot laughed, then the engineer. And soon the entire crew was laughing, not because anything was funny, but because they were alive. They climbed out one by one, moving carefully across the torn fuselage, stepping around shredded metal and dangling wires. The emergency team rushed forward, but the crew waved them off. They could walk. Against every odd, against every prediction, they were still standing. On the tarmac, the base commander met them with wide eyes. "Good God," he whispered. "How did this thing stay in the air?" The pilot shrugged. "Stubbornness," he said with a half-smile. "Mostly hers, not ours." News of the mid-air collision and the crew's survival spread across the base and then across the entire bomb group. Ground crews inspected the Liberator and found the fuselage cracked in multiple places, the wing spars bent, the control surfaces torn, entire sections of the frame barely attached. Any one of those failures should have brought the aircraft down. Combined, they made the plane a miracle. The mechanics shook their heads in disbelief. Some ran their hands along the torn aluminum as if touching the scarred skin of some wounded but heroic beast. The intelligence officers took photographs, shaking their heads with every click of the camera. Pilots from other squadrons walked up just to stare. They'd seen damaged aircraft return before, planes peppered with flak holes, engines missing, tails shot to ribbons, but nothing like this. Nothing that defied physics so completely. The medical crew examined the men. Cuts, bruises, mild hypothermia, strained muscles, a cracked rib, but nothing fatal, nothing permanent, nothing that would keep them from flying again once their nerves settled and their paperwork cleared. But for the crew, the real moment of understanding came when they stood back and looked at the aircraft from a distance. The left side of the cockpit was caved in. The top turret frame was bent backward. The nose was warped and torn open. The wing carried a gouge so deep it looked like a bite mark. To the men who had been inside it, the plane appeared even worse from the outside, like a skeleton with skin barely holding its bones in place. The tail gunner, normally the quietest man in the group, whispered, "We should have died up there." The pilot shook his head. "No," he replied softly, "not today." In that moment, the truth settled on them. They had survived not because of luck alone, but because every one of them refused to give up. Because the pilot kept fighting the controls, because the engineer kept the engines alive, because the navigator kept reading charts through a haze of blood, because the gunners held their positions, because each man trusted the others completely. In the days that followed, the war went on, missions continued, and new targets were assigned. Another aircraft replaced Iron Angel, but the crew never forgot the ship that had carried them through the impossible. They spoke of the mid-air collision in quiet tones, each man remembering different moments: the scream of tearing metal, the sudden rush of freezing air, the desperate minutes spent praying the engines would hold, the sight of England rising out of the haze. And they remembered what it felt like to stand on the ground afterward, breathing air that wasn't being pulled through an oxygen mask, feeling the sun on their faces, alive when statistics said they shouldn't be. For the rest of their lives, when people asked how they survived a mid-air collision in a bomber that looked like it had already crashed, they always answered the same way. They survived because they never stopped believing the aircraft could make it home, and because they refused to abandon each other. Their story became one of the countless quiet miracles of the air war, proof that even in the coldest, most unforgiving skies ever flown, the line between death and survival could still bend in favor of courage, loyalty, and a machine that simply refused to fall. And whenever they spoke of Iron Angel, they spoke with the same mix of awe and affection, saying, "She got us home. Against all odds, she got us home."